On behalf of my colleagues here at the Commonwealth of Learning, I welcome you all to the very first webinar of the International Partnership of Distance and Online Learning for COVID-19, organized by the Commonwealth of Learning. Thank you all for joining on this event today. In today's agenda, we'll start with an initial welcome remarks by Professor Asa Kanwar, President and CEO of Commonwealth of Learning, followed by the key presentation by our guest, Marc Prensky. Marc needs no introduction. He is a thinker and a philosopher who is practical, an award-winning, internationally sought-after speaker and author of 8 books. He coined the term digital native. Marc is the founder of Global Future Foundation and the 2 Billion Kids Project, devoted to developing and spreading young people's empowerment and making the world a better place for all of us. We are honored to have him as the first speaker for our Future of Learning and Thought Leadership series.
Thank you, Marc, for being the inaugural speaker for this series on the future of learning. When we met last September at PCF in Edinburgh, none of us imagined that the world was about to change. And what a change. In 2018, a Times Higher Education survey in 45 countries concluded that by 2030, the most prestigious universities will be offering full courses online. But as we know, this prediction has already come to pass in 2020, and a whole decade has been covered almost overnight. Neither the students, nor the teachers, nor the parents were prepared. We faced 2 major disruptions in the past 2 decades. Everybody remembers SARS and the Ebola crisis. But once the crisis passed, we went back to business as usual. But I think it's time to go beyond academic discussion and come up with concrete action, which is why it's time to broaden the discussion from the future of education to the future of learning. The pandemic has demonstrated that learning can take place beyond classrooms and institutional structures, and that, of course, it takes place from cradle to grave. Learning is lifelong, and at the center is the individual, unique and special in every respect. So how can we facilitate learning for every person? Male, female, urban, rural, rich, poor, and persons with disabilities who are being particularly further marginalized during the crisis? And how can this learning empower each individual? And we are hoping we'll get some answers from you, Marc. And we don't refer to empowerment as anything which is utopian or ideal, but as something that also advances economic development. For instance, we did a study at Call on women farmers, and this showed that learning leads to empowerment. And for every 1% increase in empowerment, there was a 2.3% increase in economic benefits. So as we explore the future of learning, what better way to begin than Marc's presentation on empowering the humans of the future, vision and hope. So on that hopeful note, let me invite you, Marc.
Thank you for inviting me to be the first speaker in this wonderful series, which is about thought leadership, and which you have called so nicely Open Door. And I bid greetings to everybody in the Commonwealth of Learning, wherever you may be in the world at this moment, whatever time it may be. Thank you for being here. And I hope we can share some interesting thoughts together. Now, the reason Open Door is so interesting to me is because it's also about open minds. And it's really important that when we are talking about new ideas, and I will share several of those with you, that we have open minds and that we keep our minds open to new ideas. And I'm sure that's what brought most of you here. I believe in priming, which is a psychological phenomenon. So I would suggest everybody say to yourself, as I will, I am open to new ideas. That means you will be even more open than you may be right now. Now, with that said, I'm going to start with something that I'm sure you are all familiar with. The famous Nelson Mandela quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." And most people have heard that quote. You may agree with it. Here's what I think. I think that in the 20th century, when Mandela said that, it was 100% true, that education at that time was the most powerful weapon you could use to change the world. It is not true, however, in the 21st century, because in the 21st century, the most powerful weapons that we can use to change the world are empowerment and accomplishment. And that's what I think we really need to be focusing on going forward. Even Gandhi, another great freedom fighter, said that true education must correspond to the surrounding circumstances. And what are our circumstances? Well, as Asha so nicely pointed out, the world is beginning to change very radically. And that change corresponds very nicely, although not exactly, with the year 2000, what we call the turn of the millennium. And I think that the turn of the millennium, 2000, will be remembered, long remembered in history as a very important time. And some of us think we're very lucky to live through that time, and some of us think we're very unlucky to live through that time, but it is definitely a time of change. And I see COVID as really being a marker for that change, because it stopped us from doing certain things that we all enjoyed doing before, like going to the theater or going to sports or meeting in person or having in-person classes. And it has led us to start doing new things. So it's kind of a filter, not necessarily the most pleasant filter we could have had, but definitely a filter. So what are the big things that are changing in the year 2000 in the world, roughly? And I see two. One you're very familiar with. One is technology. And we all know that technology has really taken off since the turn of the millennium. The year 2000 was the year when we suddenly got billions of people online. We're getting more. The technology has increased. Today we have kids in many places with very powerful computers in their pockets. Today we have the Starlink network that Elon Musk is building that's almost done, that's up in the air, that's going to connect everybody. We still have a digital divide. And we are all, I'm sure, conscious of that digital divide and how we want to change it. It will go away, hopefully, in the next 10 or 20 years, which is important because that's when our children will basically live their lives in the mid to late 21st century. And by then, we will have, at least at some level, I think, what my friend calls aorta, always on real-time access to everybody, maybe at the level that the rich people have it today. And of course, the rich people in 10 or 20 years will have many more things. But everybody will have the basics that we now think of and many of us already have. So that is the digital divide. But the second thing that's really important, that's even more powerful, is that there has been and continuing a huge change in beliefs from one generation to another. And I think this is bigger than almost anything we've ever seen before, and it may be bigger in the long run than the changes in the technology. What do I mean by this? I mean that beliefs are changing with regard not just to technology, but with property and privacy and sexuality and love. And we're seeing it change with race, and we're seeing it change with God and religion and many, many things. We can make a much longer list, even time and space. Now, what beliefs are particularly important to us? Well, there are beliefs that came from the 20th century. Remember, every adult today, every person over the age of 20 in this year of 2020 was born in the 20th century. And most of us were raised in the 20th century. So we have 20th century beliefs. And that's not bad, it's just what is. But some of those beliefs no longer work well. So, for example, we believed in the 20th century that kids were not powerful. The power was in the adults. So we had the kids taken care of. We took care of them for many, many years because they couldn't take care of themselves. We believed in the 20th century that kids couldn't accomplish much, that they couldn't get much done in the world, because it was true. Because kids couldn't do that. They didn't have the powerful tools that they have today. And more importantly, we believed in the 20th century that education was super, super important for the world. Because it was for us. It absolutely was. It made so many more people literate. It changed the lives of so many of us. And so we really wanted to pass that down to our children. And that's why we have struggled so hard to bring 20th century education to what Asha nicely calls the last person in the queue. But in the 21st century, things are different. Kids are powerful, and they're starting to know that. Kids can accomplish stuff. And we have groups like Design for Change that are working very hard in over 70 countries to give kids the idea, the belief that they can, they can get things done. And we're learning that not education as we did it in the 20th century, which was fine for then, that's not what kids need. They need empowerment and accomplishment. And we're just at the beginning of figuring out how to provide those things for the kids. So in my view, we are at a point, this great turning point at the turn of the millennium, where we face a great choice. And that choice for parents, for educators, for politicians is, do we want to pull our kids back to the past where we are from with the beliefs that we had in that time, and parents always like to pass their beliefs, or do we want to pull our kids or guide our kids into the future, even though it's an unexplored world, it's an unknown world, and it's a scary world? That's the really important choice that we have to make at this time. And I hope we will choose to guide our kids forward. And I have 3 suggestions to share with you, practical suggestions, as Asha said at the beginning, for 3 things that you might want to do in that regard. The first one is that I am sure that every single one of your countries has a Ministry of Education, or perhaps you call it a Department of Education. That's very nice, but it reflects the past. I would suggest that you go out and lobby hard to any politician that you know to change, to rename that department to be the Ministry of Empowerment and Accomplishment. Why would you do that? Well, because that's what people will do. If it's called the Ministry of Education, they'll go out and try to educate people in the 20th century way. If it's called the Ministry of Empowerment and Accomplishment, they'll go out and try to empower people and help them accomplish useful things in the world. So that's suggestion number one. Suggestion number two has to do with the fact that because education was so successful in the 20th century, we have these artifacts that are with us called schools. And those schools have courses, and those courses have classes, and we have teachers, and we have students, learners. And those are artifacts of the 20th century that have continued, of course, into the 21st and will continue. But we need something else. And so I think it's time to create, side by side with the schools that we have, something new. And somebody suggested a really wonderful name, empowerment hubs. And hubs is a great name because it suggests the networks that we have. Those hubs can be virtual, they can be in person, they're already being created in certain places like South Africa. And we need to create them. They don't exist except in pockets and ideas around the world, but we need to give parents a choice. We need to say, do you want to send your kid to school and have them get what you got in the 20th century? And that's okay. Or do you want to send your kid to a hub where they will become empowered, where they will get the opportunity to accomplish things that improve their world? That's a choice that we really ought to start giving parents and kids. And then the third part, which relates back to having our open minds, is that I think we could take a period of time, maybe even a year off, and maybe COVID is a wonderful time to do this, and say, no, we're going to not teach what we teach today. We're not going to teach the math and English and science and social studies, which I call the mess. We're going to instead have all our kids do projects that improve the country. And those projects will be chosen by the kids in function of a problem that they see in the world that they want to solve. They'll work in teams, they'll form teams, they'll be guided by their teachers and other adults, and they will do this for a year. And my sense is that any country who does this will be so much better off at the end of that year, and the students will be so much better off at the end of that year. So, I started out with vision and hope. The vision is that. The vision is of empowered kids. The vision is of kids who don't just sit there and learn, but they go out and accomplish useful things in the world and learn that they can accomplish and do things. The vision is of good, effective, world-improving people who can get things done. Google once advertised on its website, it said, we need people who can get things done. That's not what education typically produces. It produces people who are better intellectually, who maybe when they finish their education will go out and get things done. So the vision is of a huge force of kids. We have 2 billion kids in the world who are working to better their world while they are still kids. The hope is that we can do this. And I'm really convinced that we can. And I'm convinced because I see kids doing this all over the world. And if you do nothing else as a result of this evening, please contact or go online and find Design for Change. It is a wonderful organization. It's now in 70 countries, and they are really, truly empowering kids by having them do projects that improve the world that they're in. So that's really what I have to say. I think we should all be really positive, even in the face of COVID and even in the face of the times we're in. because we can, through our kids, make a much better world if we empower the kids and they learn to accomplish what they need to improve the world. So the final words I'm going to leave you with are these: the ministry of empowerment and accomplishment. Think about it. Thank you.
Marc, Professor Asha Kanwar, our most valued Open Door partners, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks for this webinar. I, on behalf of the Commonwealth of Learning, extend a big thank you to Marc Prensky for his important work in sharing with us his insights, findings, and opinions today. I mean, there were so many golden nuggets that Marc dropped that is going to be very hard to summarize, but I'm going to walk away with, I'm open to new ideas. And the concept of empowerment and accomplishment are very persuasive ones. And they force us to leave our traditional thought processes behind and think very differently when considering ways and means for nurturing and mentoring our coming generations. Another question that Marc asked, do we want our children to be pulled back into the past, or do we want to guide them into the future? And, I mean, of course, there are disruptions that he's also proposing, something like changing the Ministry of Education to not the Ministry of Silly Walks, I hope, but Ministry of Accomplishment and Empowerment. Very powerful, because it gives a meaning to the purpose of what these institutions are meant to accomplish. And what I really liked was what makes a great teacher, not a person or an individual who likes the subject that they are teaching, but the people who love the kids, who actually want to empower their wards. Marc, we're all inspired by your great words. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all our Open Door partners who have literally opened their doors and provided access to the wealth of information and knowledge that they have generated and accumulated over the years. This partnership is a shining example of how mankind comes together in times of distress and aims for the collective good. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the participants of this webinar for their active participation and a very lively question-answer session that further enhanced the value of the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, an event like this cannot happen overnight. Obviously, the wheels started rolling weeks ago. We have been fortunate enough to have a team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues at the Commonwealth of Learning who contributed towards this webinar. And out of those colleagues, of course, Dr. Sanjaya Mishra deserves a special mention. As always, the support, leadership, and encouragement provided by Professor Asha Kanwar, President of the Commonwealth of Learning, has been an essential ingredient of all such efforts. Marc, Professor Asha, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for being with us this evening. It has been a real pleasure.